"She seems a bit old for this, doesn't she?" The man in seat 12B murmured to his wife, his voice a low hum beneath the drone of the engines. He gestured with a subtle tilt of his head toward the flight attendant moving down the aisle. "I mean, it's a demanding job." Ben Carter, sitting across the aisle in 12C, overheard the comment and couldn't entirely disagree with the sentiment, at least on the surface. The woman in question, Eleanor, according to her name tag, had hair the color of spun silver, pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Fine lines mapped the corners of her eyes and mouth, telling stories of decades he couldn't begin to guess at. She looked more like someone who should be tending a rose garden or reading to her grandchildren, not pushing a rattling metal cart at 37,000 feet. But Ben, who had spent 6 years as an Air Force loadmaster, wrestling with cargo pallets in the belly of C-17s, noticed things the man in 12B didn't. He saw more than just an old woman serving coffee. He saw the way she moved. There was no wasted motion. Every step was deliberate, her center of gravity perfectly balanced against the subtle turbulence that occasionally shivered through the fuselage. When she handed a cup of coffee to the passenger in front of him, her hand was unnaturally steady. Not a single tremor. Ben had seen surgeons with less stability. Her posture was another thing. It was ramrod straight, a military straightness that no civilian ever quite masters. It wasn't the rigid posture of arrogance, but the ingrained alignment of someone who had spent a lifetime treating their body as a piece of precision equipment. She didn't just walk down the aisle, she patrolled it. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, weren't just looking at faces. They were scanning. He watched her gaze flick from a passenger's tense hands to the overhead bin latches, to the emergency exit signs, to the faces of the other crew members. It was a constant, low-level threat assessment, so reflexive she probably didn't even know she was doing it. Ben had seen that look 1,000 times in the eyes of pilots and special forces operators getting ready for a mission. It was a look that saw the world in terms of angles, exits, and potential threats. It did not belong on the face of a flight attendant serving lukewarm coffee and bags of pretzels. Her uniform, the standard airline navy blue, seemed ill-fitting, not in its size, but in its purpose. It was like seeing a thoroughbred racehorse hitched to a plow. He took the cup of water she offered, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. Her skin was cool and dry, her grip surprisingly firm. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes. For a moment, her gaze held his, and he felt an odd sense of being weighed and measured. It wasn't judgmental. It was just an assessment. Then her face softened into a polite, professional smile, and she was moving on to the next row, the quiet, efficient enigma in the navy blue uniform. The man in 12B was already absorbed in his tablet, oblivious. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous person on this aircraft wasn't in the cockpit. The flight continued its mundane journey. The cabin was filled with the typical sounds of air travel, the rustle of magazines, the soft clicks of laptop keys, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional cry of a baby from the rear of the plane. Ben tried to read his book, but his attention kept drifting back to Eleanor. He watched as the younger flight attendant, a woman named Chloe, who couldn't have been older than 25, dealt with a fussy passenger complaining about his seat recline. Chloe was flustered, her apologies high-pitched and her gestures agitated. Eleanor approached from the galley, placing a gentle hand on Chloe's arm. She didn't say a word to the younger woman at first. Instead, she addressed the passenger directly. Her voice was low and calm, devoid of the frantic energy that had defined the previous exchange. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she began, her tone placid but firm. "Unfortunately, the mechanism on that seat is fixed. However, I've noticed seat 8C is available. It offers slightly more legroom. Would you be more comfortable there?" She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't been defensive. She had simply assessed the situation, identified a problem, and offered a viable solution. It was de-escalation performed with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. The passenger, who had been ready for a fight, seemed to deflate. He grumbled an affirmative, and Eleanor personally helped him move his carry-on bag. Ben watched her lift the heavy bag into the overhead compartment with a smooth, ergonomic motion that used her legs, not her back. It was another small detail, another piece of the puzzle. He thought of the training they'd received on the flight line, the endless drills on proper lifting techniques to prevent injury. Her movements were textbook. Later, as she passed his row again, collecting empty cups, the plane hit a sudden pocket of clear air turbulence. The aircraft dropped with a sickening lurch, and a collective gasp filled the cabin. Drinks sloshed, and Chloe yelped, grabbing onto a seat back for support. Eleanor, however, barely seemed to notice. She had been reaching for Ben's cup. As the plane bucked, her body moved with it, her knees bending slightly to absorb the shock. Her hand, holding a half-full plastic cup of orange juice from the previous passenger, remained perfectly level. Not a single drop spill. She simply paused, waited for the tremor to pass, and then continued her motion as if nothing had happened. "Apologies for the rough air," she said, her voice as untroubled as a calm sea. It was that unnatural composure that finally solidified Ben's conviction. This woman was not what she seemed. He had no idea what her story was, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she had lived a life far from the quiet aisles of a commercial airliner. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the moment everything changed. It started not with a bang, but with a sudden, sharp cry from the front of the cabin. 3 men who had been sitting separately in the business class section stood up in near-perfect unison. They were dressed in nondescript clothes, but they moved with a jarring purpose that instantly silenced the cabin's gentle hum. One of them, a tall man with a cruel, thin mouth, pulled a wicked-looking ceramic blade from beneath his jacket. Another, stockier and with a shaved head, brandished what looked like a taser. The third, younger and visibly nervous, began shouting in a language Ben didn't recognize, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Panic erupted like a flash fire. Screams echoed through the confined space as passengers scrambled, their faces masks of terror. The man from 12B, who had been so dismissive earlier, was now frozen, his face pale and slack with shock. The tall man with the knife grabbed the lead flight attendant, pressing the blade to her throat. He snarled in heavily accented English. Quote 5. The stocky man moved toward the cockpit door, while the nervous one started down the aisle, waving his hands erratically, his eyes wide and wild. Ben's training kicked in, his heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind went cold and clear. He scanned the hijackers, noting their positions, their apparent weapons, their body language. The leader was confident. The stocky one was the muscle. The one in the aisle was the weak link, the wild card. His gaze then, instinctively, found Eleanor. He expected to see fear, the same terror reflected on every other face. He saw none. She was standing near the galley, partially hidden by the service cart. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't frozen. She was absolutely still, a statue of calm amidst the maelstrom. Her blue eyes, no longer placid, had become chips of ice. They weren't watching the scene with fear, they were analyzing it with a chilling, predatory focus. She was tracking the movements of all 3 men simultaneously, her head barely moving. Her breathing was slow and even, her chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm. Ben had seen men twice her size and half her age break down in high-stress training scenarios. This woman, who he'd guessed was in her late 70s, was exhibiting a level of composure that was nothing short of superhuman. The nervous hijacker was getting closer, his erratic movements bringing him just a few feet from her position. He was shouting at the passengers, trying to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. Eleanor's hand, the one that had been so steady with the coffee cup, rested lightly on the handle of a metal coffee pot in the service cart. The young hijacker, emboldened by the lack of resistance, made a critical mistake. He turned his back for a second to yell at a passenger who was sobbing too loudly. In that sliver of time, Eleanor moved. It wasn't the frantic lunge of a desperate person. It was an explosion of precise, economical violence. She took one step, closing the distance, and swung the heavy steel coffee pot. But she didn't swing it wildly. She moved like a fencer, her entire body a coiled spring. The bottom edge of the pot connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. Before he even hit the ground, Eleanor was already moving again. She smoothly retrieved the taser from his limp hand and melted back into the shadows of the galley, the entire sequence taking less than 2 seconds. The cabin was so consumed by fear that only a handful of people, including Ben, had seen what happened. The leader at the front heard the thud and turned, his eyes narrowing. "What was that?" he yelled, his voice tight with alarm. From the cockpit, a muffled shout and the sound of a struggle could be heard, followed by a heavy thump. The stocky hijacker had breached the cockpit. A moment later, the intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the captain's reassuring voice. It was the hijacker. "We have the cockpit," he announced, his voice strained. "We are in control. Do not try anything foolish." A new wave of despair washed over the passengers. They had lost, but Ben's eyes were still on Eleanor. She hadn't celebrated her small victory. She hadn't panicked. She was simply listening, her head tilted slightly, processing the new information. She was still in the fight. She held the captured taser with a practiced grip, her knuckles white, but her hand steady. She was waiting for her next opening. The balance of power had shifted, but the game was far from over. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened and the young co-pilot, a man named David, stumbled out, his face ashen. The stocky hijacker shoved him from behind. "He's useless!" the hijacker spat, gesturing with his head back into the cockpit. "Tell them!" David looked out at the terrified passengers, his eyes wide with fear and shame. He hit the captain," David stammered, a trickle of blood running from his own lip. "Captain Jensen is unconscious. He hit his head on the console." The hijacker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We are changing course. Any heroes will be dealt with." He slammed the cockpit door shut, leaving the young co-pilot standing there, trembling. The plane, which had been flying smoothly, began to bank in a wide, clumsy arc. It was uneven, the movements of an amateur. The hijacker was trying to fly a multi-ton commercial jet, and he clearly didn't know what he was doing. This was the moment. Eleanor stepped out from the galley. She looked at the terrified co-pilot, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak to him. She spoke past him, her voice ringing with an authority that defied her age and uniform. "Chloe," she called out, and the younger flight attendant flinched. "Get the zip ties from the emergency kit. Secure that man on the floor. Now." Chloe stared, frozen. Eleanor's voice sharpened, cutting through the paralysis like a diamond blade through glass. The younger woman scrambled to obey, her fear of Eleanor suddenly greater than her fear of the situation. Eleanor then turned her attention to the co-pilot. She asked, her voice clipped and professional. David, the co-pilot, just stared at her. Quote 19. He stammered. Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes boring into his. Quote 20. Quote 21, David whispered. And quote 22. Quote 23. Eleanor's question was blunt. "Can you fly it?" David shook his head, shamefaced. I can't get back in there. He's armed." It was then that Ben saw the quiet resolve settle over Eleanor's features. The flight attendant was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Quote 26, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the silent cabin. Quote 27. Ben felt his jaw drop. It was suicide. But as she walked toward the cockpit door, he saw it again. The utter lack of fear. This wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a calculated plan. She was holding the taser low against her leg, out of sight. She was about to knock on the door of a tiger's cage, and she looked as calm as if she were about to offer it a cup of tea. Eleanor reached the cockpit door and knocked. It was a soft, unassuming knock, she said, her voice deliberately pitched to sound non-threatening, even a little frail. Inside, the hijacker grunted something unintelligible. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. A few passengers screamed. Eleanor said, a tremor of what sounded like fear in her voice. A perfect imitation. Quote 31. There was a pause, then the sound of the lock disengaging. The door cracked open, and the stocky hijacker peered out, his face slick with sweat. He saw an old woman and a bleeding, scared co-pilot. He saw what he expected to see. His mistake was not seeing the taser she held hidden behind her skirt. His mistake was not seeing the icy resolve in her eyes. As the door opened wider, she moved. It was a blur of motion. She drove her shoulder into the edge of the door, forcing it open, while simultaneously jamming the taser into the man's thick neck. The crackle of electricity was loud in the sudden silence. The hijacker convulsed, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and then he crumpled to the floor of the cockpit, landing half on top of the unconscious captain. Eleanor stepped over him without a second glance. Her eyes swept the console, taking in the flashing warning lights, the chaotic state of the instruments. The plane was in a shallow, uncontrolled dive. The leader, still at the front of the cabin with his hostage, screamed her name, but it was too late. Eleanor was already in the pilot's seat, her hands moving with a fluid certainty that was breathtaking to behold. She strapped herself in with swift, practiced motions. Her fingers danced across the control panel, flipping switches, adjusting dials, her mind seemingly 1,000 steps ahead of the aircraft's chaotic state. Ben, watching from the aisle, felt a profound sense of awe. He was witnessing a master at work. The worn, elderly hands that had served him water just an hour ago now held the lives of 200 people, and they did so with an impossible grace and confidence. The change in the aircraft's behavior was immediate and dramatic. The clumsy, sickening lurching stopped. The shallow dive leveled out. The groaning protest of the airframe eased as the plane was brought back under precise, deliberate control. Eleanor's voice, when it came over the intercom, was completely transformed. The soft, gentle tone of the flight attendant was gone, replaced by the crisp, clear, and utterly commanding voice of a pilot. Quote 32. There was no panic, no triumph, just a simple statement of fact. She then keyed the radio, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos of the past few minutes. Quote 33. There was a stunned silence from air traffic control. Then, a hesitant voice came back. Quote 34. Eleanor's hands never stopped moving, trimming the aircraft, checking her instruments. She didn't have time for a long explanation. She simply replied, "Qualifications are sufficient. I have the aircraft." Ben watched the young co-pilot, David, who had followed her into the cockpit and was now staring at her with a look of pure reverence. He was watching a legend come back to life. Another, older voice suddenly cut in on the radio frequency, this one from the control tower. It was shaky, filled with disbelief. Transcon 721. "Ma'am, can you please state your name for the record?" There was a slight pause. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the horizon. Quote 37. A wave of whispers rippled through the control tower, audible even over the radio static. The older controller's voice was thick with emotion. Quote 38. He breathed, using a name that was spoken with reverence in the halls of aviation history. Quote 39. The name meant nothing to most passengers, but to Ben, who had grown up on Air Force bases listening to his father's stories, it was everything. Valkyrie. The call sign of a ghost, a legend from the Cold War. A test pilot who had flown experimental craft to the edge of space, a woman who had broken speed and altitude records that still stood, a pilot spoken of in the same hushed tones as Chuck Yeager. He had thought she was a myth, a composite of several pilots, not a real person, and she was flying his plane. The leader of the hijackers, still at the front of the cabin, seemed to shrink. His weapon, his threats, were meaningless now. The power on the aircraft had shifted completely, not through force of arms, but through sheer, overwhelming competence. He was just a man with a knife on a plane being flown by a legend. He dropped the knife. The landing was not easy. The hijackers had damaged some of the hydraulic systems in their clumsy attempt to fly, and a nasty crosswind was sweeping across the designated emergency runway. Through the cockpit window, Ben could see the flashing lights of dozens of emergency vehicles, a silent testament to the drama unfolding in the sky. Yet, inside the cockpit, there was an island of pure calm. Eleanor's voice was a steady, soothing presence, not just for the passengers, but for the terrified young man in the co-pilot's seat. "All right, David," she said, her tone that of a patient instructor. "The hydraulics are sluggish, so the controls will feel heavy. I need you to watch the airspeed for me. Call it out every 5 knots below 140. Just focus on that. Can you do that for me?" David, who had been paralyzed with fear moments before, nodded, his purpose restored. He had a job to do. He was no longer a victim. He was part of the solution. 140, David called out, his voice gaining strength. 135. Eleanor's hands were a blur on the yoke and throttle, making 1,000 micro-adjustments. She wasn't fighting the wounded plane. She was dancing with it, anticipating its every sluggish response, compensating for its injuries with a lifetime of experience. She spoke as she worked, more to herself than anyone else. Quote 44, she murmured to the aircraft, quote 45. To Ben, it sounded like she was talking to an old friend. The runway rushed up to meet them. For a heart-stopping moment, a gust of wind caught the left wing, trying to push them off course. Eleanor's feet moved on the rudder pedals with a speed that belied her age, correcting the drift with an instinct born from 10,000 hours in the air. The touchdown was perfect. Not just good, not just safe, it was flawless. A gentle kiss of rubber on tarmac that sent a sigh of collective relief through the cabin. As the plane slowed, applause broke out, growing into a roar of cheers and sobbing. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She calmly guided the massive jet to the designated taxiway, shut down the engines in the correct sequence, and ran through the post-flight checklist from memory. Only when the final switch was flipped and the aircraft was silent and still did she allow herself to lean back in the pilot's seat, closing her eyes for a single fleeting moment. Within minutes, the cabin doors were forced open and SWAT teams stormed the aircraft, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. They found a scene of surreal calm. The remaining hijacker was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, defeated. The other was zip-tied on the aisle floor. The passengers were crying, hugging, and cheering. The officers moved cautiously toward the cockpit, expecting a confrontation. They burst in to find an old woman in a flight attendant's uniform sitting calmly in the pilot's seat, patting the hand of the young co-pilot. An officer, confused, lowered his weapon. He asked, bewildered. Eleanor unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements a little stiff now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked at the officer, her pale blue eyes clear and direct. She said quietly. As the authorities led the subdued hijackers away and paramedics tended to the injured captain, a man in a dark suit, an FAA official, approached Eleanor. He held a phone to his ear, listening intently. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and awe, the official said into the phone. Quote 49. He lowered the phone and looked at Eleanor as if she were a monument. Quote 50 he said, his voice filled with reverence. Quote 51. Eleanor simply nodded, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. Quote 52, she said. Quote 53. She bypassed the official and walked back into the cabin, moving down the aisle, offering words of comfort, checking on the people who had been in her care. She was a flight attendant again, her duty not yet over. Ben watched as she paused to soothe the crying baby, her gnarled, heroic hands gently stroking the child's head. He finally understood. For her, it had never been about being a pilot or a hero. It had always been about service, whether at the edge of the atmosphere or in the aisle of a commercial jet. It was just a different uniform for the same unwavering commitment. As she was finally escorted off the plane by grateful officials, her silver hair illuminated by the flashing emergency lights, her stride was still perfectly straight, her dignity absolute. She caught Ben's eye one last time and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a shared acknowledgement of a truth that now burned brightly in the minds of everyone on Transcon Air 721. True strength isn't loud. It's quiet, it's competent, and sometimes it serves you coffee before it saves your life.